Hello, everyone. I hope you're having a great day. Thank you for attending our first webinar for the Play to Zero Approach to Carbon Neutrality series. We'll get started here in just a few moments.
All right, welcome everybody. My name is Bradley Vogel. I am the Senior Manager of Membership Services and Events at the Green Sports Alliance, and I wanted to welcome everyone to the first iteration of our Play to Zero webinar series. So a little bit about the Green Sports Alliance. The Green Sports Alliance and Blue Strike are teaming up to provide members with a Play to Zero reporting framework and specific strategies to address emissions reductions in the energy, waste, and transportation sectors. The Play to Zero reporting framework is a new leadership recognition platform and performance metric tool that will help members calculate and report on continuous improvement over time. Not only do we want to help you understand how we use this framework, we also want to present specific strategies and best practices that will help you take additional actions to reduce greenhouse gases as far as net zero. I would like to introduce you to Kristin Cushman, who is the CEO of Blue Strike, and she is going to provide an overview of the entire workshop series, as well as lead our discussion today around energy. At the end of her presentation, we'll circle back to the Play to Zero framework and incorporate Andrew Bohenko, the Sustainability Manager at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, for a little bit more of a hands-on case study. With that, I will turn it over to Kristin. Thank you so much for being here today, and we're looking forward to learning about how we can minimize our energy footprint.
Thank you, Bradley. I'm Kristin Cushman, obviously CEO of Blue Strike, and for those of you who do not know Blue Strike, we are a small but mighty firm working across the industry, designing carbon neutrality plans for universities, cities, and sporting venues. And we have one of our trusted partners with us today, Brian Stern with GluMac. He's joined us today to provide a deeper perspective on the technical side of building electrification. And then, as Bradley mentioned, Andrew Bohenko from Mercedes-Benz Stadium is with us to offer some best practices and innovations around energy, things that his stadium is working on. So as you know, many sports venues are putting sustainability front and center to their core mission. Some are aligning their sponsors around sustainability, while others just report annually on specific goals. It is rare that a large sport venue would not have a sustainability goal. In fact, fans are starting to expect that venues have environmental commitments in place. And the same is true for corporations and universities. We need to be ready to respond to this new trend by demonstrating our ongoing commitment to improving our environmental and social footprints. So as Bradley mentioned, this is the first in a series of 4 workshops framed around carbon neutrality. Today's workshop obviously is on energy, followed by a workshop in November on waste, a workshop in January focused on transportation, and a final workshop in April that will introduce specific tools that can be used to help assess and prioritize funding and project implementation. So as we move through this presentation, I think Shay queued it up with a poll, but please feel free to type in your questions into the chat. We're going to address them at the end during a Q&A session. But if there's any questions that aren't addressed, if we run out of time, we can follow up via email. And I also wanted to mention that as we go through this slide, I've put in some live links. I didn't realize there was a handout section, so we'll send you this PowerPoint after, I think tomorrow, and then you can have access to all the links that are embedded in here. So the first slide, there are 5 phases. You know, many of you are in different stages of creating and implementing environmental strategies. So for the sake of everyone, I'm kind of keeping this at a high level, and I've outlined 5 phases that need to be considered in order to move toward carbon neutrality. And for those of you who want more information, more detail, you can obviously reach out to me afterwards, and I can share additional links and resources to you. So the first phase is to calculate your greenhouse gas emissions. I think most of you probably are underway in doing that. As they say, you can't improve what you don't measure. So having an understanding of your emissions is the starting point for that measure or that measurement. And I put a link into the here. We recommend the Greenhouse Gas Protocol, which provides requirements and guidance for organizations as they prepare an emissions baseline. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, those emission baselines in a minute. The second phase is to determine strategies that will transition your organization to carbon neutrality, which we're going to highlight here in a minute. And then how to prioritize those strategies over a 5, 10, or 20-year time horizon. You know, what would the next steps be once you identify those strategies? And the final phase is implementation. This is the most critical step to ensure that as you are in the planning process, you track performance over time so that you always know where you stand. And then, of course, the final phase, I guess, is to report on your success using the Play to Zero framework. And as I mentioned, Bradley's going to introduce that toward the end. So let's first talk about the greenhouse gas emissions. Play to Zero is going to help you measure reductions in usage, and then we're going to translate that usage into emissions, which is the first step. As this graph shows, the dotted line, which is very faint at the top, represents an example of current emissions forecasted out to 2035 in this example. This assumes a business as usual scenario, which in other words means that emissions will maintain a slight increase over time if the organization does nothing different moving forward. Forecasted emissions factor in things like increases in staff, fan attendance, new infrastructure, and as these factors increase, they will create more emissions that will have to be tackled. So the quicker you can start reducing those emissions, the less you're going to have to tackle over time. Once we compile the emission data, we then start applying emission reductions based on the strategies that we are working on. We will talk about some of those strategies on the next few slides, but you can see that each wedge represents emission reductions from various strategies, such as electrification, fleet, and renewable energy. And then there's this fourth wedge, utilities. The forecast takes into account the increase in renewable energy that local utilities provide. So for example, in California, our utility, PG&E, will provide 60% renewable electricity in their mix by 2030. Transitioning away from fossil fuels to renewable sources eliminates emissions altogether. So as the grid becomes more renewable, the challenges to achieve carbon neutrality will become easier. It would be good to understand what renewable energy portfolio your state has committed to, and then factor that into your forecast. So in this example, you can see the utility wedge kind of adds to some of those reductions. So I wanted you to be aware of that. The other thing I wanted to mention is that for a carbon neutrality goal, each organization can decide if that goal includes all scopes of emissions or just scope 1 and 2. And we will address scope 3 emissions when we have our workshop on transportation, but for today's purposes, I just wanted to highlight that scope 3 emissions can be left out of a carbon neutrality commitment and reported separately, at least in year 1, because it is pretty daunting to capture all of those emissions. And the last thing I wanted to say is that if your organization does not have a greenhouse gas reduction target, I would recommend creating one. In California, the state has set a goal of reducing greenhouse gas emissions 80% below 1990 levels by 2050. And the federal government targets 50% reduction from a 2005 level by 2030. So this is putting pressure on cities, counties, and large-scale businesses to follow suit. Looking at transitioning to electric vehicles as one of the strategies that we are going to present today. Even if your venue only has a small suite of vehicles used for grounds and maintenance, transitioning them to all electric as those vehicles reach the end of their useful life should be considered. Keeping in mind that transitioning away from fossil fuel vehicles reduces emissions, and if you can charge those electric vehicles with renewables, then you will just have eliminated all of the emissions associated with your fleet. So that's something important to register. The primary challenges of fleet electrification are determining appropriate replacement vehicles and developing charging infrastructure. So if we look at determining appropriate replacement vehicles, I put a link in here as well. The Department of Energy has an online alternative fuels data center that is free. It can help identify what types of electric vehicles exist, what impact the charging would have on your energy load, and how much charging infrastructure would cost. You'll want to click on that and take a look. Next, you might want to consider establishing what they call an EV first purchasing standard, and that just commits an organization to at least consider EV options as part of its replacement plan. And not all vehicles have a like-for-like EV option, so another part of the analysis is to explore what we call vehicle right sizing, which is the process of reassessing the operational requirements of existing vehicles to see if a different, usually smaller vehicle could be used to replace the existing vehicle. So one example is that currently there are no replacement options for pickup trucks, and given that most maintenance vehicles are pickup trucks, you might want to consider a small van, which has doors, you can put the tools inside, you can lock it, so maybe there's some opportunities there for consideration. There is a cost savings when buying electric vehicles over time because you don't have to pay for ongoing fuel prices, and the maintenance for EVs is a fraction of what you would pay for a gas-powered vehicle. So this is an incentive for people to start moving in this direction. There's also rebates that exist. There should be rebates in every state to help subsidize the cost of vehicles. California has, we have a local air resources board. They provide a clean vehicle rebate program, which offers $1,000 to $7,000 for the purchase of EV vehicles. And the Department of Energy has a commercial electric vehicle tax credit that provides businesses up to $7,500 per vehicle. So you might want to check to see if you have a air resources board, if your state has a community choice energy program. A lot of those will give rebates and incentives for the purchase of EV vehicles. If we look at charging infrastructure represents an investment without a clear payback. So this is the more challenging side of transitioning. Costs related to the design, engineering, trenching, those types of technical costs can often be a barrier for organizations trying to transition to EVs. So you might want to put together a kind of a comprehensive analysis to determine whether the savings accrued from purchasing the vehicles could potentially offset the costs for the charging. As a solution, though, as a funding solution, framing fleet electrification as a capital improvement project is an effective way to enable EV adoption. So that's just one tool for your toolbox. And transitioning the conversation from electric vehicles to solar and storage seems appropriate. As I mentioned, renewable energy does not generate greenhouse gas emissions. So the more renewable energy, the more emission reductions are immediately captured. Localizing solar and storage projects is becoming an important component to a venue's ability to both reduce emissions and address specific needs, including disaster preparedness and the resilience of critical facilities and infrastructures. And I'm sure that most of the universities and venues on this call are starting to become more aware of the role that their campus or their venue could play in that. So as an example, again, I'm using California because that's what I know best. Our utility, PG&E, is shutting down power when heat waves occur due to the amount of people turning on their air conditioning when they get hot. And as these power outages occur, entire stadiums and research facilities could be temporarily shut down. So installing solar and storage offers a solution to these situations. It disconnects the venue from its reliance on the grid. And in addition, I just have this little graph here that I found, but adding storage provides an increase in savings because you can capture energy loads during low rate periods and dispatch that same energy during high peak rate periods. For example, the yellow line shows what the normal solar generation would look like. You can see that the solar hits a peak around 12 o'clock when the sun is right above, but that is not when sports venues need the majority of their energy. They need the majority at night, and that is when the energy is at its highest price. So batteries would be able to charge throughout the day and then dispatch energy at night as indicated by the orange and blue sections. So long-term, this will become even more important as you install public-facing EV charging stations. You won't want to pay peak pricing for fans to charge their vehicles. So a storage unit would allow you to manipulate how energy is used and when. And with that, our next strategy is around building decarbonization, and I'm going to turn it over to Brian Stern with BlueMac to take us through kind of a more technical approach to what that translates into. So Brian, take it away.
Thanks, Kristin. So yeah, as Kristin said, my name is Brian Stern. I'm a director of energy with BlueMac. And we support engineering, design, mechanical, electrical, plumbing, as well as energy and sustainability. Within the context of carbon neutrality, decarbonizing building systems is often one of the most impactful as well as the most challenging strategies. It helps to first, within a carbon neutrality plan, really focus on reducing your direct emissions first, and often that comes most from your building systems, which include your heating, cooling, lighting, and other energy systems within the building. When we're looking for stadiums or sporting facilities, there's really 5 categories of projects that we look to, and the first is energy efficiency, deferred maintenance, energy conservation, electrification, as well as the electricity supply. So we'll go into a little bit more detail about some of those strategies, as well as how you can approach the planning phase in order to develop a roadmap of transitioning your facilities from the existing systems into a more carbon neutral operations. So if we go to the next slide, I'm wanting to start with the overall framework for decarbonizing building systems. I think when we're looking at building systems, there's a lot of complexities around the infrastructure and how do you transition that. And I think we can break down decarbonizing building into sort of 3 main steps or strategies. within that framework. And the first is we want to invest in cost-effective energy efficiency projects. I think the work that a lot of stadiums and sporting facilities have done around LED lighting are continuing to be cost-effective. The second is to electrify natural gas systems. So can we switch from fossil fuel-based natural gas heating to electric systems? And then third, can we procure or produce 100% clean electricity to supply those systems? And that will set the trajectory towards a carbon neutral operations. I think in principle, it's sounds simple. In practice, there's a lot of complexities around that. Some of the considerations for sporting facilities specifically, or in general, is first we want to understand what are the goals, what are the key performance indicators, what are the policy risks. There's a lot of cities and municipalities that have established policies around electrifying buildings that would impact a sporting facility. And third, how can we develop a facility-specific decarbonization roadmap that'll guide future decisions? How do we align with equipment life cycles or the end of life? And I think that's generally the most cost-effective way of decarbonizing infrastructure is if an equipment is reaching its end of life and we're going to need to upgrade, what's the marginal cost of switching to a more or less carbon-intensive piece of equipment? How can we leverage other ongoing infrastructure upgrades? There's always infrastructure upgrades going on in stadiums. So how do we pair decarbonization projects with other projects? Coordinating with other new electrical loads, between vehicles, carts, ground equipments, temporary power, broadcasting. There's a lot of new electrical demands that are being added to stadiums. So if we're making upgrades, how do we plan for longer term strategies? And that goes back to having that roadmap. And then finally, identifying other co-benefits. Does the stadium provide community resiliency, and does that open up opportunities for additional funding to pay for some of the upgrades that might be required? I think there's different ways you can approach this. The LEED EBOM is one example, working with Levi Stadium, and that is a good framework for assessing sustainability as well as providing an energy audit to understand different energy uses and strategies. Another strategy is really to focus more on the infrastructure. At Lumen Field, they're really focusing on mechanical infrastructure and what are the specific projects and infrastructure that needs to change rather than a higher level energy audit. I think both are effective ways and will lead towards having a more facility specific roadmap to guide future decisions. If we go to the next slide of what does that planning process look like, if we want to start with, we have a goal of reducing emissions, how do we take that, how do we develop an action plan? And I think we can break this into sort of 4 main steps. And the first is to measure and plan. So what are the goals of the organization? What are the key performance indicators that we want to keep track of? How are we going to be making decisions? And then how can we collect all the data that we need in order to assess strategies? Then we want to look at, what are the specific projects within a building that will help to reduce energy and carbon. So that can include energy efficiency, conservation, electrification. Based on all those projects, we want to do some scenario analysis and planning. So how should we be thinking about these projects long term? How does this align with our existing capital plans, our investments? And we want to look at how does this align with existing equipment life? If a boiler is going to be needing to replace in 5 years, we want to plan ahead so that we have assessed the opportunity to potentially electrify that piece of equipment. And then finally, how do we develop a monitoring and implementation plan? And I think often these projects, as far as fully transitioning to an all-electric building or to reducing emissions, is a long-term phased effort. So having this plan and having an idea of where you want to go in the future really helps to make decisions and then allows to not invest in assets or equipment that might be obsolete in the future based on your carbon reduction goals. So I think like Kristin mentioned, measuring, it starts with understanding what your emissions are, then starts with what are the opportunities, and then how should we be implementing these opportunities over that next 5 to 10 years. Some of the specific strategies on the next slide around building decarbonization, we can break into 4 main categories. The first are traditional energy efficiency projects around LED lighting, retrofits, adjusting power factors, or energy conservation. So how are we scheduling the building? Stadiums are used very different than other buildings. What are the energy management systems within the building? Can we provide retro commissioning? Finally, electrification and electricity supply, which I think are newer strategies Electrification is switching from natural gas-based heating systems to electricity. And then pairing with clean power allows for a building to be carbon neutral. And there's various ways that we can look at electricity, whether that's provided from the local utility. There's a lot of states within the US that are transitioning to clean power and have commitments to provide clean power. So for example, in California, there's a goal of being 100% clean power by 2045. There's other on and off-site strategies. On the next slide shows the electric utility commitments throughout the US. Currently within the US, there is around 62% of electricity use is covered by a legally binding or commitment from a utility to provide 100% clean power. And this covers a majority or a large portion of the United States. So we know that in the future by 2045 or 2050 that there is a large portion of the US that will have access to clean power. So by switching or planning to switch from natural gas to electricity provides a direct pathway for facilities and for buildings to be carbon neutral in the future. So that's really important, and I think what's been driving the trend towards electrification. So on the next slide, if we look at an individual building and we compare a fossil fuel-based system, so your traditional system will use electricity for cooling, gas for heating. Under an all-electric system, you might have heat recovery or heat pumps, all electric sources. Based on emissions factors average in 2021 within California, your facility would see a roughly 30% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. So it's a fairly significant amount. But what's important is to look at that over the life of that equipment from now for the next 30 years as you're continuing to operate those chillers, those boilers, or other equipment within the building. So on the next slide, we'll see what that emissions looks like over time. As the grid transitions to clean power, you can see in yellow the emissions associated with electricity trend towards zero, while the natural gas continues through the life of that equipment. Now let's look at if we had an all-electric system. So on the next slide, we can see what that looks like of transitioning to an all-electric. So by 2045, we have clean power. What we'll see is over that 30-year period, we'll actually see a 70% reduction in emissions. So it's really important to look at how our decisions made today are impacting the life cycle emissions, not just based on emissions factors for the current utility grid. So driving into electrification and what those projects specifically look like. On the next slide, we've broken down, I think a good way to think about electrification is sort of in three main categories. The first is your central utility plant. So if you have centralized heating and cooling systems, how do you transition those to heat recovery chillers? You can look at geothermal, electric boilers, or heat pumps. And then second, distributed heating. So how do we look at heating and cooling equipment that might be spread out throughout a facility? And then third, water heaters. Breaking down all of the existing equipment and infrastructure within your building, categorizing what equipment uses natural gas, and then going through the exercise of doing the engineering and financial feasibility can lead towards what are the potential future projects that we can look to or at a facility. The central utility plants are generally the most challenging and the most capitally intensive projects. So on the next slide, we've broken down how we've approached and would recommend approaching electrifying central utility plants. At the core is improving building efficiency. So we want to reduce loads. That is your traditional energy efficiency and deferred maintenance projects. Next, we want to look at maximizing heat recovery. So how can we recapture heat? Third, how do we optimize those systems? And then finally, how do we provide additional heating sources in order to get towards carbon neutral? And those we want to minimize as much as possible since they're generally the more capitally intensive projects. And on the next slide, we'll show sort of what a traditional or typical central utility plant system looks like compared to an all-electric plant. Everything within the building can potentially remain the same, and we're switching out those natural gas boilers to electric heating systems around heat recovery chillers or heat pumps. So I think the central utility plant is certainly an area that would warrant a specific focus and attention in order to make sure that you're aligning with equipment replacements and the general maintenance practices so that you can identify opportunities before they come up. With that, I will hand it back over to Kristin.
Thank you. Get my camera set back up. Okay. Well, I appreciate that, Brian. You covered some of the stuff that I was going to cover as well, but I think just how do you take this planning process and consider solar, consider transitioning fleet, consider electrification, and how do you prioritize it over time? So I was just going to give you a few kind of recommendations. One, obviously, is to look internally at your building policies, potentially creating a no new gas policy by updating venue design standards to support electrification moving forward. There's also ideas around bulk procurement strategies for solar. Bulk strategies can play a role in prioritizing solar. So if your venue is located, for example, in a city that is also considering solar development, there might be an option to bundle all of those projects together to save on price. You could also check with your local utility and see what projects they are installing regionally, especially if you have a community choice energy partner in your community. The other is, as I mentioned, to align the capital improvement plan budget. This should be the basis for prioritizing energy efficiency infrastructure. And if the capital improvement plan doesn't get you over the finish line, you could consider assessing third-party financing, such as ESCOs, or in some markets they have on-bill financing through utilities. So those are just some ideas. And then next, we're gonna go to Andrew, who's gonna talk briefly about the awesome things that are happening at Mercedes-Benz Stadium.
Yeah, thanks, Kristin, for passing it back over to Andrew. I'm going to lead Andrew through a quick, Q&A session, because going through this, we want to dive into, seeing how this is actually being implemented in action. So for those on the call, Mercedes-Benz Stadium is a LEED Platinum building design and construction facility. So that's the highest level of building design and construction facility rating you can get. So with that, I'll jump right in. Welcome, Andrew. Thanks for being here. Appreciate your time today. So we're jumping right in. So when Mercedes-Benz Stadium was constructed in 2017, what on-site renewables were built into the stadium's design?
Yeah, so like you said, we achieved a LEED Platinum for the building design and construction. And since the beginning, Arthur Blank wanted to incorporate unique features into the energy reduction, renewable energy, stormwater management, and water efficiency. That was the main goal. And since construction, Mercedes-Benz Stadium has continued to commit to that and be sustainable and curb its environmental footprint. And that all started at the inception of design. So for instance, we have 4,000 solar panels on site that generate power that's pumped back into the Georgia grid. And that is enough solar energy to supply 160 households in Atlanta with renewable energy for the year. So that's something that started at its inception. And with that, it's not just about renewables, it's about reduction as well. So part of that LEED Platinum was how are we going to reduce the amount of energy that we output. So the entire stadium is outfitted with all LED lights to reduce its electrical consumption by about 29% each year. We also have a reduction that is in the way of natural light. So we have 160,000 square feet of ETFE. That's ethylene trifluoroethylene. That's very thick plastic that creates these windows that not only give a beautiful view to the city, but allow natural light to pour into the stadium. So on non-event days when there are crews working on the field, they're able to work by natural light instead of us using stadium lights to light up that field. So these are just a couple of things that we do in general every day to kind of not only find renewable energies, but also reduce the amount of output for emissions that we have within the stadium.
Yeah, thanks, Andrew. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned ETFE because that seems to be the building material of choice for new stadium construction. I mean, SoFi Stadium, their entire roof is ETFE. I want to say Allegiant Stadium, US Bank Stadium. Not only does it allow a lot of natural light, it also cuts the amount of structural steel needed because it's so much lighter than using alternatives like glass and things like that. But
what's great about ETFE as opposed to glass is it's a less porous material. So it actually helps keep the heat or the AC inside the building, and the heat in the summer in Georgia is pretty ruthless. It keeps that outside, or the cold air in the winter outside, and that helps us curb our electrical bills as well.
Yeah, no, and that's I'm glad you said that as well, the non-porous aspect, because up here in Minnesota, where I'm based out of, they deliberately use ETFE to help shed snow loads as well, because it is very easy to help slide that off. So no, so you mentioned electrical reduction. So are there other kinds of reduction that takes place in the stadium?
Yeah, so one of the important parts of the stadium is that Mercedes-Benz Stadium sits atop the Proctor Creek watershed, which is historically known for flooding. The topography of Atlanta sits where the west side sits much lower than the east side. So all the concrete buildings around us push the water towards the west side of Atlanta. So one of the things that Arthur Blank wanted to do when designing the stadium was he wanted to curb some of that flooding. So our entire roof system has a gutter system that pushes water to one of two places. We have a 680,000 gallon cistern that is used to recycle water from that gutter system that's used to water the Home Depot backyard, which is an 11-acre green space. It's used to water our urban garden, which is 9 raised garden beds, and we did about 200 pounds of food this year, food donation with our spring harvest. And it also is used to water the turf field. And any excess from that is used to help alleviate the water that's used in our cooling towers for our AC units. The second part of that is a 1.1 million gallon water retention vault that's built underneath the stadium. And that actually is used and tapped into the Atlanta city water, where because we get so much water runoff, all of our gutter systems run into that vault where the water is retained there until the flooding is alleviated, and then over the drier days that follow big rainstorms, it's leached back into the water system to help alleviate the flooding that happens in that west side.
Great. No, that's amazing. So in terms of a fan engagement perspective, how does Mercedes-Benz Stadium encourage patrons to reduce their carbon output coming to the stadium? I know we talked about electrification of vehicles on site, but I think taking that a step further, how can we encourage fans to do things like that as well? So I'd love to dive into that as well.
So there are two.
I was just going to interject and say that's the framing for our next workshop, just so you know.
Yeah, so part of that LEED Platinum comes in the way of how are you going to get fans to the stadium by reducing carbon emissions. So we picked a site that is between 2 MARTA stations, so that encourages fans to use public transportation because egress is so much easier. Instead of all the fans pouring into one train station, there's 2 points of contact for them to either enter the building or leave the building through public transportation. We also supply a bike valet for every single major event. So we get 100, 200 bikes that park in that bike valet that alleviate other emissions as well. And we encourage that and promote that on socials. In addition to that, we have EV charging stations on site that are employee focused and also fan focused as well. The ones that are for fans are in conjunction with the Georgia World Congress Center, who operates the parking decks that we have. So we have a number of those around site for fans to use. And then we have 6 EV charging stations that are daily used for employees at the stadium. And that's in conjunction with Georgia Power. And so these kind of things are able to push people to reduce emissions, specifically the public transportation, the ability to get in and out of a busy city without actually having to drive in and then sit in traffic on the way out for hours and hours greatly reduces the amount of emissions, even if it's people that are driving in from farther away and then parking at a train station that is just a little bit farther out from the stadium instead of everybody congesting this one area.
Sure. Do you know what percentage of your attendees take MARTA?
So it fluctuates on the time of year, but about 25%. So we see about 60% of the people that use vehicles. Within that, it's hard to tell how many EV vehicles are used, but every single charging station is utilized during an event, just because we have 70,000 people coming into the stadium. And then I would say about 25 to 30% are using that MARTA transportation, and then you have different people that are walking in, taking rideshare or biking into the stadium.
That's amazing. So you said so all the charging stations fill up. Do you guys have plans to add more? Is there a trend that more people are asking about it?
It's a trend that more people are asking about. We want to upgrade the stations that we have that are for our associates, because those are the ones that are most utilized on a day in and day out basis. And then we'll be working with the Georgia World Congress Center to implement more EV charging stations, and with Georgia Power to implement more charging stations within those parking decks as well.
Great, great. And then finally, looking toward the future, what are you guys going to continue to do to achieve carbon neutrality?
Yeah, so in addition to leveraging the stadium's 4,000 solar panels that we have on site, Mercedes-Benz Stadium is working with Georgia Power, like I mentioned earlier, to find creative solutions to kind of optimize the stadium's energy output, and then also looking at community-focused kind of initiatives to curb carbon emissions or offset carbon emissions as well. We want to be a steward in that, and we want to push the narrative forward there and kind of encourage other stadiums and other businesses within Georgia to look locally and to find initiatives that are within our local state to kind of offset emissions within our localized area.
That's great. I mean, it sounds like you guys have a great relationship with Georgia Power. So yeah, I would say to anyone on this webinar, really, if you haven't reached out to your local utility provider, they could be a great resource to help, really curb these efforts. So I don't have any other questions. Kristin, do you have any other questions for Andrew?
No, thank you. What you're doing is pretty inspirational. So thanks for joining us today. And I think you're going to join us for the next, I think our next workshop is in November. And so we can talk in more detail about some of these transportation, what I call scope 3 emissions.
Yeah, the scope 3 emissions and then our waste reduction and recycling program are two things that we're very excited about, and that we have a lot of stuff that we're hopefully going to be releasing in the future on how we're kind of curbing emissions and kind of reducing our footprint in general in a holistic kind of sustainability sense.
Great. We look forward to that discussion. I think it's on November.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yeah. Well, I want to make sure that there's some time for Q&A, so I'm going to kind of go through this next slide fairly quickly. We talked a lot about some of these leveraging resources. We talked about the bulk procurement idea, but potentially there's universities that are in some of these communities where the stadiums are, and there might be universities doing research on new energy technologies. There might be access to internships that could help the venues conduct energy audits, for example. And then we also mentioned the community choice energy programs. You should definitely connect with your local utility or your local community choice energy program to see what they have in terms of resources. The second thing is engaging stakeholders. Behavioral change programs, we just talked about that. I mean, that's fun for fans. It's fun for students to get engaged. And it's also, partnerships that you can build with different agencies and try to align the campaigns that are going on regionally and have them executed on site. There's campaigns that you could do, obviously the installing power strips for staff, encouraging fans to turn off, lights as they leave, if you don't have sensors, those types of things. So those are just some examples. I wanted to show you one idea. These are two links that I have put in here, and I'm hoping yes. So this is one. You guys can still see my screen. So I wanted to just introduce real quick before we move into the Q&A, an idea of a green revolving fund. And it may be that you already know about this, but I wanted to just get it into your thought process. Setting up a green revolving fund establishes a positive cash flow scenario for implementing all projected projects. So the fund could be an internal bank account captures the savings from the energy efficiency projects, and it reinvests that savings to pay for additional energy projects over time. So in this graph, we had $2 million as seed money to pay for initial projects. Now, you don't need that money that much, but for this client, this is how much they had to start. If you don't have that, you could put grants in there, rebates. You can use your capital improvement budget. But as you can see by the black line, the fund dips down after investing in the first project. That project then creates savings, which you can see by the black bar as it's moving up, which leads the black, the line goes up and up over time. Over the course of the implementation period, the fund pays for all the projects with a sum of savings exceeding the expenses. So that blue line is the cumulative cash flow savings, where in this scenario, this client earned as much as $9 million over the course of, it looks like, 15 years. And so understanding how to capture that savings and putting that savings toward additional projects is something that I think you all should consider. And then the second thing I wanted to share with you is this sustainability tracker. You can call it a climate action tracker or a carbon neutrality tracker. I wanted to leave this with you. This was put together again for one of our university clients. This is public information. It's a spreadsheet that helps clients track performance of established goals. So you can see in the first column, there's goals listed, and then they're broken down by individual strategies and actions. And then a metric is assigned to each goal as a way to measure the success of implementation. So it kind of functions as a workbook, and it serves as the single point for planning and reporting. So this can be put out on a drive. You can assign certain people to manage these actions, and then you can use this to report out as an internal document. So those are the two resources that I wanted to share with you, and that then leads us to the next piece, which is the most important piece for today, is the Play to Zero measurement and verification framework. I will pass it back to Bradley to provide us with kind of a nuts and bolts on how that process works.
Yeah, thanks, Kristin. So many of you probably have heard of the Play to Zero platform. So at this point in this webinar, we do have a handout on Play to Zero in terms of a Play to Zero onboarding guide. But really what this tool is for, as Kristin described, is being able to measure and verify all of these amazing strategies and projects we were just alluding to. So when we get into this platform, I like to call it Diet Lead, because it's the same platform that is used for LEED V4.1 O&M certification. However, what we're looking for with Play to Zero is for facilities to at least start tracking. So if you're not tracking energy, waste, water, this is a great tool to start that process. So you can start benchmarking your own performance against itself. So with that, it is a free tool with a GSA membership as well. If you want to dive more into it, feel free to contact me. I love walking through it with people. And the great thing about it is it does provide analytics like LEED gap analysis. So if your organization is interested in pursuing some type of third-party certification, it can provide that level of gap analysis. And in addition, the Green Sports Alliance is using this tool also to award teams for their reductions. So what I mean by that is what we're looking for is benchmarking against your own self. So for example, if you're an older facility, you could go back and say, all right, 20 years ago, this was our energy use. 10 years ago, we did a retrofit project. You're able to really see those reductions. And what we want to really do is get teams, venues, leagues really to track and say, all right, we want to reduce our energy by 30%, 50%, and then up to that carbon neutrality. And then from a GSA summit perspective, we are going to award and reward these facilities for incremental improvements against themselves. So unlike other third-party verifications and things like that, you're not getting compared to a industry baseline. It's solely based off of your performance. So we mentioned Mercedes-Benz Stadium as a whole. They're a great building design and construction facility. They do a lot of operations and maintenance correct in terms of environmental sustainability. So if your facility is not at that level, you don't have to worry about comparing to them. You can really just focus on your own benchmarking. So please feel free to reach out if you are a venue, a stadium, a team, and you want to really dive into this more in depth. So with that, if we go to the next slides, I wanted to open it up for Q&A, and I see we already have one question. Shay, do you want to take it away from our end?
Sure. Thank you, Bradley.
Yeah.
So coming from Adam with AEG, he gives an example here. So in California during last year's heat wave, we were being asked by our utility provider to shed all available load and even run on emergency generator power, which is diesel if possible. So in knowing that there are geographical differences, as we look to electrify venues to aid in decarbonization, how are you thinking about balancing that movement with the instability of grid reliability?
Should I take that, Brian?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, I'm not the technical part of my staff, but I can. I think I understood the question. I think we talked about it a little bit in terms of how much energy should be stored in order to withstand some of those impacts. I think the answer would be a financial answer, and it would also be specific to each facility. So if facilities had, various sections that were, if the stadium were to be considered a disaster, element where people could go and use the stadium during a flood or during a fire, I think that would inform how much energy you want to have kind of on hand. So I'm not sure if there's a completely straightforward answer for that.
Yeah, I think it really starts with just understanding your existing infrastructure. What do you currently have in emergency power? And then I think, understanding what are the new loads and how do you carry that? So I think that's where really having, a really good understanding of what your existing infrastructure is and where do you want to move helps to identify, what are the specific strategies for your facility? How can you disaggregate loads or shed loads during an emergency? So I think there's a lot of different ways, from an engineering perspective, you can take that. And that's where I think, having that roadmap, having those goals of where you want to be in the future helps to guide those decisions.
Great.
Thank you, Brian and Kristin.
Yeah, it looks like that was the only question. So folks on the webinar, feel free to reach out. You got a panel of experts up here, so let us hear it. We want your toughest questions. So bring it up.
Yeah, I'll hop in here and ask a question. Does Play to Zero offer local services and resources to help with reducing the specific facilities footprint? Just came into the chat.
Say that one more time. It was kind of cutting out.
Yeah.
Sorry about that. So does Play to Zero offer local services and resources to help with reducing the specific facilities footprint?
No, so not at a regional level. We do have Play to Zero partners, which Blue Strike Environmental is one of them. But on a regional, local scale, not yet. That is great feedback, though, and I think that would be a great place to take it to look into more regionally focused, maybe best practices for utility providers, in a certain region. But on that same note, one thing we're trying to do from a GSA perspective is try to get more regionally focused, roundtables and group meetings to where, for example, like in New York, those teams will have to abide all by very similar, local law 97, for example, in New York, for their energy use. So we want to really look at these things from a very regional perspective. So yes, I think in the long term, I think we will take it to that. But really right now at the basic level, Play to Zero is a great tool to start tracking. If you're not in there tracking, it's a great tool to really just start that moving in the right direction. So great question.
Yeah, and I'd like to just add a little context is Blue Strike, we do a lot of climate action planning and carbon neutrality planning for cities and counties. And so it's very possible that we've done a lot of the research already for the utilities, where the community choice energy programs are. And if your venue falls within that region, we could help you with best practices and share with you at no cost just what we've learned in that area. So just, you know, continue to think of us as a resource.
Yeah, great. Definitely.
Great.
Shay, would you like to plug Green Sports Day while we have some time?
Yeah, that would be great. As some of you, I'm sure, know, Green Sports Day is coming up on October 6th here. So we are engaging teams, stadiums, venues across the globe and lighting green to bring awareness and action to the sports greening movement. And I know a lot of you on the call are already lighting green, but if you aren't already, we are engaging through lighting the roof, LED screens, and even your marquee boards. So you can join. I think we're at 90 locations today, actually lighting green, sharing support with hashtag Green Sports Day on social media, and really taking action for positive social and environmental impact. And we have a really awesome toolkit you'll find in the handouts here on GoToWebinar. So feel free to download that. And if you have any questions, you can send me an email and we can get something on the calendar.
Yeah, thanks, Shay. And then also on the slide you guys have in front of you our next 3 upcoming workshops. So they're all based on approaching carbon neutrality. So as Kristin described earlier, we're going to dive very much into depth on best practices for waste reduction. So we'll have Andrew on board to talk, a lot about what he's been able to do at Mercedes-Benz Stadium, as well as our other solutions partner Rubicon to help, because they're more of a waste-focused consultancy company. That'll be November 16th at 11 a.m. Pacific Standard Time. Then we have a more detailed look into Scope 3 emissions, particularly as it relates to transportation. That will be January 26th, 2023. So we're already looking to next year. And then finally, approach carbon neutrality tools to compare funding and implementation pathways. So today we gave you a high-level overview of, ways to approach your program. So that last one will really give you the tools to get that funding and those implementation pathways. So high level today, and we'll get more granular as we keep moving on. In the handout page, we have a Green Sports Day marketing toolkit, food diversion playbook that GSA just released within the last few weeks, and then the Play to Zero onboarding guide. We will be sending out this presentation as well for anyone who wants to get more information. And then we will send out all the contacts of everyone who was on this panel today. So if you have any follow-up questions, we'd love to get in contact and really just keep moving this needle in the right direction. So
May I real quick?
Yeah.
I just wanted to say that if anyone, as you just said it, has questions, please feel free to reach out. But in terms of that final one in April, if you have specific questions or please feel, or you want us to talk about something specific because you want to learn more, if you could give us a heads up, we'd be happy to tailor the content to make sure that it continues to be relevant to what you need to be focused on. So I just wanted to mention that.
Yeah, no, that's great. And same goes for us. Let us know what you guys need, because we're here to help you all. So with that, I know we have a few minutes left. So I just really want to thank Kristin, Brian, Andrew, and Shay on our team. So for being here today, giving us your time. I think this was very beneficial to the group. And I look forward to the next round of workshops. So with that, I'll give everyone, 3 minutes back of their day. You're welcome. Use it wisely, and then we will be in touch.
Thank you very much.
Thank you guys for having me.
Yep. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.